I never thought I would sit in front of this camera again and speak about love. Not after everything that happened, the tours, the rumors, the endless interviews where every answer was measured, rehearsed, sterilized into something safe. But tonight feels different. Tonight, I want to speak as the person behind the lights, not the performer the world memorized. Because there's something I need to say, and I can't keep it silent anymore. I'm getting married, and the world is going to talk, speculate, dissect, and twist this until it becomes something unrecognizable. But before that storm begins, I want to tell you the truth, from my own mouth, in my own words. If you're watching this, take a breath with me. Maybe you followed my story for years. Maybe this is the first time you're seeing me outside a stage. Either way, I want you to know this. What I'm about to share isn't just a love story. It's a story about choosing authenticity over expectation, heart over heritage, soul over silence. It started on an evening that looked like any other. We had just finished rehearsing for a new project, something intense, something that drained every ounce of energy from us. The studio lights dimmed, leaving only the low hum of machines and the smell of sweat and dust. Everyone was tired. Taehyung sat in the corner humming a melody he hadn't recorded yet. Namjoon scribbled lines of poetry on his phone. Jin packed snacks into a paper bag like a caring brother who couldn't stop mothering us. Yoongi scrolled through beats in his headphones, pretending not to care, but caring too much. Hoseok danced alone in the hallway, a silhouette of joy that never needed an audience. And Jimin, he was quiet, more quiet than usual. He sat by the window, the reflection of Seoul's skyline trembling across the glass like distant lightning. I remember how he looked that night. The air around him felt heavier, like he was carrying a weight no one else could see. I asked if he was okay, and he smiled the way he always does when he's not okay at all. That half smile that says, "Don't worry," while silently begging someone to. Later, when everyone left, I stayed behind. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something deeper. I found him still there, looking out at the city. He didn't turn around when I spoke. "You should go home," he said. "It's late." "I could say the same to you," I answered. For a long time, we just stood there, the hum of the city filling the silence. Then, he said something I'll never forget. "Do you ever feel like you're performing even when no one's watching?" That question hit harder than any note I'd ever sung. Because yes, I did. Every day. Every breath. The version of Jungkook the world saw was sculpted by years of perfectionism, discipline, expectation. But the real me was quieter, more uncertain, still trying to understand what freedom actually meant. We ended up talking until dawn that night, about music, fame, childhood, and the strange loneliness that hides inside applause. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere between laughter and silence, I started seeing him differently. Not as Jimin, the member I'd harmonized with for over a decade, but as Jimin, the person gentle, fragile, infuriatingly brave, carrying so much empathy it could drown the world. Over the next months, something unspoken began to bloom between us. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't planned, it was quiet, it was the kind of closeness that didn't need words to exist. A look across the stage, a hand brushing past another during choreography. A message at 2 in the morning saying nothing but, "Are you awake?" Then came the moment I realized I was in love. We were in Busan for a fan event, standing backstage as the crowd roared our names. He was nervous, it never showed, but I knew. His hand trembled just slightly, hidden behind the mic. Without thinking, I reached for it. He looked at me, eyes wide, vulnerable, searching, and in that instant, the noise of 10,000 fans vanished. The lights, the chants, the pressure, all disappeared. There was only us. After the show, he said quietly, "You shouldn't have done that. People notice." "I don't care," I replied. But I did. We both did. Because love, in our world, wasn't just personal, it was political, explosive, dangerous. When my family found out, it wasn't through me. Someone leaked photos of us leaving a cafe at midnight. Nothing inappropriate. Just two people laughing under streetlights. But the internet doesn't need facts. It needs fire. Within hours, headlines screamed, "Jungkook and Jimin secretly dating?" My mother called first. Her voice trembled not with anger, but fear. "Do you know what this could do to you?" she said. "To your career? To your brothers?" I wanted to tell her that I'd already thought about all of that. that I'd weighed the risk against the quiet truth in my heart. But all I said was, I know. My father didn't speak for a week. When he finally did, it was during a late-night visit to my apartment. He stood by the doorway, eyes heavy, and said, "Love isn't wrong, Jungkook, but timing can be. You fought so hard to build this life. Don't burn it for something the world might never understand." But here's the thing about love that people forget. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't negotiate with logic or fear. It simply demands to be lived. So I didn't listen. I kept seeing Jimin quietly, carefully. We spent Sundays cooking ramen in my kitchen, laughing about stupid things, whispering about futures we both knew might never happen. Those were the happiest days of my life. Not because they were grand, but because they were real. One evening, after practice, we drove to the Han River. It was freezing, and he wore this oversized coat that made him look smaller than he was. We sat in silence, watching the water. Then he said, "Do you ever wonder what love looks like when no one's watching?" I looked at him. "This," I said, "it looks like this." It would have been simple if life were just about two people. But it never is. There were managers, contracts, sponsors, expectations. There were brothers Taehyung, who pulled me aside one night and said, "Are you sure you're ready for what comes with this?" Namjoon, who didn't say anything, just hugged me like he already knew the answer. Jin, who made dinner the next day and served it with an awkward smile, pretending it was just another Tuesday. Even Yoongi, who rarely shows emotion, sent me a text that read, "Be careful, not because you shouldn't love, but because love like that will test everything you've built." And it did. Rumors multiplied, fans divided. Every small gesture became a headline. There were days when Jimin avoided my gaze in public, not because he wanted to, but because cameras were everywhere. There were nights when I sat alone, scrolling through hateful comments until my vision blurred. I kept asking myself, was I selfish? Was I risking everything not just for me, but for him, too? But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the food bank story he told me once about volunteering during our trainee years, long before debut. He said he used to help an old man there who would always whisper, "Keep showing up even when no one claps." That phrase stuck with me. Because that's what our love felt like, showing up even when no one applauded, even when the world booed. Months passed. The scandal faded. People moved on, as they always do. But our world didn't go back to normal. It became something new, something quieter, deeper. We stopped hiding, not because everyone accepted it, but because pretending to be strangers hurt more than being misunderstood. Then came the breaking point. My family organized a private dinner, just relatives, no cameras. My father spoke first. "We raised you to be strong, Jungkook," he said, "to make choices that honor your name. But this isn't just about you anymore. Think of your mother. Think of the company, your group, your legacy." I looked around the table, faces I loved, faces that had shaped me, and then I looked at the empty chair beside me, the one where Jimin should have been, if the world were kinder. I realized something in that moment. Legacy means nothing if it demands that you betray your heart. So I stood up, bowed to my parents, and said, "I love you, but I can't unlove him." Silence filled the room. My mother cried softly. My father closed his eyes, and I walked out, feeling both terrified and free. That night, I drove to Jimin's place. He opened the door, eyes swollen from crying. Before he could speak, I said, "They told me to choose," so I did. He stared at me for a long time, then whispered, "Are you sure?" "No," I said, "but I'm certain." We laughed through our tears. The kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion, from knowing that love doesn't always look heroic, it just insists on existing. It's been months since then. We've learned to live in the in-between. Some days are hard, some are soft. Some mornings I wake up beside him and still can't believe it's real. Other mornings, I wonder how long we can keep balancing on this fragile piece between public duty and private truth. But then he smiles, and everything makes sense again. I once thought success was about how loud the world could applaud. Now I know it's about how quietly your heart can rest when you're with the right person. I've achieved things most people only dream of: stages, awards, records. But none of them ever made me feel the way I did the first time Jimin whispered, "You don't have to perform here." He meant it literally, but I think it was also a prayer. A reminder that love isn't about the spectacle, it's about the sanctuary. And maybe that's why I'm sharing this now. Not to justify, not to confess, but to show that behind every polished performance, there's a person still learning how to live truthfully. So if you're watching this and wondering whether love is worth defying the world for, my answer is yes. Not because it's easy, but because it's honest. Because the right person doesn't complete your story, they remind you that it's okay to write a new one. I don't know what the future holds. The world will say things. Some will cheer, others will curse. But I've learned that peace doesn't come from their voices. It comes from mine. And right now, my voice is calm. I chose him, and I didn't listen, and I don't regret it. I thought the hardest part would be telling my family. I was wrong. The hardest part was waking up the next morning and realizing the entire world already knew. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating messages, missed calls, headlines, trending hashtags. My name, his name, words like betrayal, shock, courage, scandal. There were photos of us from months ago that I didn't even know existed. Jimin laughing at something I said in a van. My hand on his shoulder backstage. Both of us sharing headphones during a flight. To us, those were ordinary moments. To the world, they were evidence. The company called an emergency meeting. I walked into a room filled with managers, PR staff, legal advisors, and silence heavy enough to crush oxygen. Someone finally spoke. "We can manage this," they said. "But you have to cooperate. You have to follow our guidance." They laid out the plan like a military strategy. Public statement, scripted apology, a temporary break from appearances, subtle language about brotherhood and misinterpretation. Every word crafted to erase the truth. Every sentence designed to make honesty look like confusion. I sat there, staring at the paper in front of me, and for the first time in my career, I couldn't read the words. They blurred into static. I folded the paper slowly and placed it on the table. "I won't lie," I said quietly. The room went still. Someone sighed. Another person muttered something about contracts. A senior manager looked at me with genuine concern. "Jungkook, you don't understand what this will do." But I did. I understood completely. I understood that truth costs more than fame ever could. I understood that honesty doesn't come with applause. It comes with consequences. After the meeting, I walked out without saying another word. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Jimin. The message was simple. "Don't say anything yet. I'll handle it with you." When I got to his apartment, he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered newspapers and open tabs on his laptop. His eyes were red, his face pale, but when he saw me, he smiled. Not the smile for cameras, the real one, small and trembling, but full of courage. "They're going to twist everything," he said. "Then let them," I replied. "We'll tell our version." That night, we recorded our own message. Not scripted, not staged, just us sitting side by side on the couch, speaking directly into the camera. I remember the warmth of his hand against mine as I said the words. This isn't about headlines. This isn't about rebellion. It's about truth. We're human, we love, and we're not ashamed. We uploaded it at midnight. Within minutes, it spread across every platform imaginable. Some fans cried, others raged. Some called it brave, others called it betrayal. I didn't sleep at all. Neither did he. We stayed up, watching the comments pour in, waves of emotion from every corner of the world. By morning, everything had changed. The industry, our image, our future, it all hung in the balance. But when I looked at him sleeping beside me, calm after the storm, I realized something simple. Even if everything else fell apart, this us was still standing. The following weeks were chaos. Some shows canceled our appearances. Some brands paused partnerships. But something unexpected began to happen too. Letters arrived, thousands of them, from people who had hidden their truth for years, people who said, "Your courage gave me permission to breathe." One letter I'll never forget came from an older fan in her 60 seconds. She wrote, "When I saw you both, I saw my younger self, the one who gave up the person she loved because she was afraid. Don't let fear write your story." That line burned into me. Don't let fear write your story. The rest of the members reacted in ways that reminded me why we were brothers, not just bandmates. Namjoon came over one evening holding 2 coffees and no words. We sat in silence for a while before he finally said, "You know, All these years, we talked about freedom in our lyrics. I guess you're the first to actually live it. Yoongi texted me a single sentence. If it's real, don't apologize for it. That was his way of saying, I've got your back. Hoseok showed up with food and laughter, pretending nothing was wrong, but I caught the way his hand shook when he hugged me. Taehyung called late at night, his voice tired but steady. I'll protect both of you however I can, he said, even if it means fighting people I love. And Jin, he didn't say anything at all. He just looked at me one afternoon and whispered, you look lighter. That's all that matters. Their support didn't make everything easy, but it made it possible. A month later, my family invited me home. I hesitated, but Jimin told me to go. They need to see that you're still you, he said. So I went. When I walked into the house, my mother was in the kitchen. She looked at me like she didn't know whether to hug me or scold me. Then she just sighed and said, you haven't been eating well. And that was it, the ice broke. My father joined us later. We sat around the table in silence until he finally said, the world changes whether we want it to or not. Maybe this is how it learns. For the first time, I saw him smile, not out of agreement, but acceptance. That night, I realized something about love that no one teaches you. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about practicing honesty in a world that profits from masks. Weeks turned into months. The noise slowly faded. Some people forgot, some didn't, but we stopped caring. Because we were building something deeper than reputation, we were building peace. We traveled together when schedules allowed, sometimes to quiet places where no one recognized us. Once, in Jeju, we rented a small cottage near the sea. No cameras, no scripts, no expectations, just mornings filled with soundless laughter and evenings with music that never needed to be released. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Jimin looked at me and said, do you think we'll ever stop being afraid? I thought for a while, then said, maybe fear doesn't disappear. Maybe we just learn to move with it. He smiled, tracing patterns in the sand with his fingers. You always think too much, he said. And you always feel too much, I replied. Maybe that's why we work, he whispered. There were moments of doubt, still days, when the weight of public scrutiny felt unbearable. But every time I faltered, he reminded me of who I was beneath all the noise. He reminded me that love isn't fragile, it's resilient when it's honest. Months later, we decided to tell the rest of the story ourselves. Not through interviews or press releases, but through something we knew best: music. We wrote a song together, quietly, without anyone knowing. It wasn't a love song in the traditional sense. It was about endurance, truth, the strange beauty of standing still while the world spins around you. The lyrics said, they told us to hide the sunrise, but we watched it anyway. They told us to whisper our names, but love doesn't fade when you say it aloud. When we released it under a pseudonym, fans found out within hours. But instead of outrage, something shifted. The comments weren't angry, they were moved. People recognized sincerity when they heard it. That song changed everything. Not commercially, spiritually. It reminded people why they loved music in the first place, not for perfection, but for truth. Over time, the industry's resistance softened. Invitations returned. Partnerships resumed. But we were different now. We no longer belonged to anyone's image of us. We belonged to ourselves. One evening after another long day, Jimin turned to me and said, do you ever think we'll get married? I looked at him for a long moment. If the world allows it, I said, and if it doesn't, then we'll do it anyway. He laughed softly, resting his head on my shoulder. You really didn't listen to anyone, did you? No, I said, smiling. And I'm glad I didn't. There's something powerful about silence after confession. It's not empty, it's full. Full of everything you've been afraid to say. Finally finding air. As I sit here now, months later, watching him make tea in our small kitchen, I realize this is what peace looks like. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of someone who helps you hear your own heart clearly again. To anyone listening who feels like they're too complicated to be loved, too visible to be vulnerable, too afraid to tell the truth, listen carefully. You're not alone. The world will always try to make love look like something manageable, something that fits into headlines or hashtags. But real love doesn't fit anywhere. It just exists, quietly, relentlessly. And if you ever find it, hold on, even when they tell you to let go. Especially then, because that's when you'll know it's real. I used to think that healing was a quiet thing, something that happens slowly and invisibly, like a bruise fading beneath the skin. I know now it's not. Healing is loud. It shakes the walls of everything you used to believe. It demands you to look at the wreckage and still find something worth saving. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a rhythm I'd never known before. The chaos of fame still lingered at the edges, but inside the small world Jimin and I built, there was stillness. It was strange to wake up and not feel like I had to become someone else before stepping outside. I could just be. Sometimes, in the mornings, I'd find him sitting on the balcony, his hair a mess, sunlight scattered across his face. He'd be lost in thought, humming softly, always half a melody behind the wind. And I'd think, this is the sound I've been chasing all my life. Not applause, not recognition, just this. We weren't trying to prove anything anymore. We weren't fighting the world, we were learning how to live in it. There's a difference. Fighting drains you, living restores you. I began to visit my family more often. The first few times were awkward, the kind of polite warmth people build when they're trying to forgive but don't know how. My mother cooked too much, as if food could fill the spaces words couldn't. My father asked about music but never about Jimin, though his eyes softened whenever I mentioned him. Then one evening, after dinner, my father stood by the window and said, "You know, I used to worry that you'd lose yourself in all this fame. Now I see you found something most people never do." He didn't have to say the word. I knew he meant love and acceptance. It took years for my family to understand that love doesn't dishonor anyone, it humanizes them. My mother told me later, in a quiet voice, "I prayed that you would find someone who could see you beyond the stage lights." Maybe this is my prayer answered, even if I didn't expect the form it came in. I didn't realize I was crying until she reached out and wiped the tears away. "You're my son," she said. "You were before the fame, and you will be after. That's never going to change." For the first time in a long time, I believed her. Things within BTS shifted too. Not in ways the public could see, but in subtle threads of understanding that bound us closer. The years had taught us that loyalty wasn't about agreement, it was about presence. Even when opinions clashed, even when silence hung heavy, we still showed up for one another. There was a night when we all gathered again. No cameras, no staff, just us in the studio where it all began. Someone brought soju, someone else brought fried chicken. The air smelled like memory. Namjoon looked around the room and said, "You know, we've survived everything. Rookie days, burnout, fame. Maybe this was just another kind of test." Yoongi smirked. "More like another album in disguise." We laughed, but underneath the laughter was something sacred. Understanding, brotherhood, forgiveness. Jimin was quiet most of the night. Later, when the others had gone home, he looked at me and whispered, "You didn't lose them." "I know," I said. "I think we all just learned to see each other differently." There was truth in that. The world often thinks that love divides, but sometimes it reveals what was already true. Our relationships didn't fracture. Because of it, they deepened, matured. We became more human to one another, less untouchable, more real. Months turned into a year. Public perception softened. What had once been scandal became story. People moved on, but I didn't, because I didn't want to. Some stories are meant to keep unfolding. Jimin and I began to travel more, not for work, but for life. Paris in the rain, Kyoto in spring, Iceland in winter. In every city, we walked without disguise, hand in hand when no one was looking, side by side when someone might be. Sometimes people recognized us, but instead of whispers, we received quiet smiles, nods of understanding, sometimes a simple, "Be happy." One afternoon in Kyoto, we wandered into a small bookstore. Jimin picked up an old poetry book, its pages yellowed, its spine cracked. He opened it and read aloud. "To love is not to possess. To love is to accompany." He looked up at me and smiled. "That's us," he said. He was right. Ours wasn't the kind of love that demanded the world's approval. It was the kind that simply stayed quietly, even when no one was watching. That night, back in our hotel, I thought about how far we'd come. From hiding in shadows to walking freely under the same Sunday. From whispered fears to open laughter. From shame to grace. I realized something else too. The world had not changed overnight. Prejudice still existed. Rumors still sparked now and then. But what changed was the way we carried ourselves through it. We stopped waiting for permission to be whole. One evening, Taehyung came to visit. He had just finished filming a drama and looked exhausted. We sat on the balcony of our Seoul apartment, the city glowing beneath us. He didn't say much at first, then he said, "You know, when I first saw everything unfold, I was scared. Not for your career, for your peace. But seeing you now, I think maybe peace was what you were chasing all along." I nodded. It was, and maybe love was just the path to it. He smiled. Maybe that's all love, really, is someone who reminds you how to breathe. After he left, I sat in the dark, thinking about that. About how every person I loved, my family, my brothers, him had taught me something about love that words could never hold. There was the love that teaches patience, the love that forgives silently, the love that challenges you to grow. And then there was the love that simply stays. Jimin was all of them at once. Our wedding wasn't a grand spectacle. It wasn't even public. It was a promise whispered in a place that had no microphones. A ceremony small enough to fit inside a single moment. It happened on a Sunday morning, under a tree near the sea in Jeju. The same tree we'd stood beneath during one of our early trips. No audience, no orchestra, just the sound of wind and waves. I remember his hands trembling slightly as I slipped the ring onto his finger. He laughed softly. "You're shaking more than I am. Maybe because I still can't believe this is real," I said. He looked at me, eyes shining, and whispered, "It's real because you chose it." Those words have stayed with me, because love isn't found, it's chosen every single day. Especially on the days it's hard. Especially when the world doubts you. When we returned to Seoul, we didn't announce it. We didn't post pictures. It was ours, and that was enough. But somehow, word still spread, because truth always does, quietly, inevitably. This time, the reaction was different. There were still critics, but there were also blessings. People who had once been silent now spoke kindness. Artists, fans, strangers, they sent messages of hope. Some said our story gave them courage to live theirs. And maybe that's the real purpose of love, not to be admired, but to awaken something in others. In the months that followed, I found myself writing again, not for albums, but for peace. Late nights turned into pages of reflection, songs about patience, forgiveness, stillness. Jimin would read them in the mornings, smiling softly, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing. "You write differently now," he said one day. "How so?" "You write like someone who's already forgiven the world." Maybe he was right, because I had. Forgiveness isn't saying what happened was fine, it's saying I won't let it own me anymore. And so, life went on. Quieter, truer, fuller. Sometimes, when I perform now, I look out at the crowd and see faces that don't just cheer, they understand. They've lived, they've fought, they've chosen, and when I come home after those nights, Jimin is there. Sometimes waiting with tea, sometimes asleep on the couch, the TV's still on. I look at him and think, this is what all the noise was for, to arrive at this silence. There are still moments when I remember the fear, the headlines, the coldness of those early days. But those memories no longer hurt. They remind me that love, when lived honestly, transforms even pain into purpose. If I could speak to that younger version of myself, the one who stood trembling before the cameras, terrified of what the world would think, I'd tell him this: you did the right thing. You didn't listen. You followed your heart. And because of that, you finally found home. And if you're hearing this, whoever you are, wherever you are, remember, love isn't meant to be perfect, it's meant to be true. I used to believe legacy was measured in numbers, records sold, arenas filled, trophies lined up beneath studio lights. For years, that belief shaped every decision I made. But when the noise faded and I was left with nothing but my own breathing, I realized legacy isn't built on applause. It's carved quietly in the hearts we touch without meaning to. After the wedding, the world didn't end. The sun still rose, music still played, and yet everything felt different, gentler, as if the air itself had forgiven me for holding my breath too long. I no longer lived for headlines. I lived for mornings. Some mornings, Jimin would wake first and wander into the kitchen, his hair a storm of gold and brown, humming the melody of a song we hadn't written yet. He'd make coffee the way only he could, too sweet, too much cream, a sin against caffeine, but a small act of tenderness. He'd hand me the cup with that same crooked smile that once made me afraid of how much I could feel. We learn to move through ordinary life like students relearning language. Grocery shopping without disguise. Waiting in line at the bakery. Watching old movies with subtitles too small to read. Each act was a rebellion and a prayer, at once proof that normal could be sacred. I still worked, of course. Music never left, it just changed shape. When I stepped into the studio now, I didn't hear pressure, I heard possibility. The group gathered again, older, softer around the edges, but sharper in purpose. Namjoon arrived first, notebook full of lines about freedom. We've sung about dreams our whole lives, he said. Maybe now it's time to sing about living them. Yoongi nodded from behind the console. Honesty sells better than perfection anyway. Hoseok laughed. Finally, something I can dance to without pretending. Even Jin, back from his long hiatus, smiled and said, let's just write something we'll still be proud of when no one's listening. And Taehyung, he looked at me across the room, eyes full of quiet understanding, and murmured, let's make something that feels like peace. That day we began a new album, one that wasn't about image or expectation, it was about becoming. Every lyric carried traces of our scars and small miracles. Every beat pulsed with gratitude. For the first time, we weren't chasing success, we were documenting survival. During breaks, Jimin would stop by, bringing snacks for everyone, pretending not to hover near the mixing desk. The others teased him, but affection lingered beneath every joke. When he left, Yoongi muttered, you know, he brings more calm than a whole team of therapists. He did. His presence had that effect, turning tension into something breathable. Weeks later, when we finished the final track, we listened in silence. The song faded out on a line Namjoon wrote, but we all felt, maybe the point was never to arrive, but to walk together without fear. That night, I went home and found Jimin asleep on the couch, the light still on. I covered him with a blanket and sat beside him, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. I thought about how many years I'd spent running from rest, mistaking motion for meaning. But this stillness, this simple presence, felt like the true summit I'd been climbing toward all along. A few weeks later, I visited my parents again. This time, Jimin came with me. My mother opened the door, and for a moment, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Then she smiled, wide and warm, and said, so this is the one who taught my son how to breathe. Jimin bowed, nervous, but she just took his hand and led us inside. Dinner was quiet at first, then laughter crept in like sunlight between curtains. My father asked Jimin about his family, his childhood, his dreams beyond music. Jimin spoke softly, honestly, and by the end of the meal, my father was nodding along, eyes glistening. When we left that night, my mother pressed something into Jimin's hand, a small silver pendant she'd worn for years. For protection, she said. Every love needs blessings, not approval. We drove home in silence, both of us too full for words. Sometimes the world doesn't change with declarations. It changes with small acts of grace like that. As months passed, I started to notice how time itself had slowed, not in seconds or hours, but in weight. The heavy rush of expectation that once chased me had turned into quiet intention. We spent weekends painting, cooking, tending to a tiny garden on our balcony. The plants didn't care who we were, they only asked for light and patience. Maybe love is the same. There were still moments of pain. The world doesn't forgive easily, and some corners of it never will. But we learned that forgiveness doesn't have to come from others. It can begin within. One evening, after reading some harsh article online, I felt that old ache return, the one that whispers, you're still not enough. Jimin sat beside me and said, you know, I used to think acceptance meant being loved by everyone. Now I think it just means being loved by the right ones. That simple sentence lifted something heavy from my chest. He was right. The right love makes the noise outside irrelevant. I began writing again that night, not lyrics, just reflections. Words poured out like rain, gratitude, loss, courage, faith. I realized that storytelling had always been my way of making sense of chaos. Maybe that's why I'm telling all this now, to remember how far honesty can take us when everything else fails. As I finish this page, the city outside is quiet, the sky painted in gray and lavender. Jimin is asleep again, his hand resting on the notebook beside me. The ring on his finger catches the faint light from the window. For a long time, I used to see rings as symbols of boundaries of belonging to someone else. Now I see them as circles, infinite, like promises that echo through time. Not ownership, but presence. Sometimes I wonder what our younger selves would say if they saw us now. Would they be shocked, proud, terrified, maybe all three? But I think they'd recognize the music in our laughter, the rhythm in our quiet. They'd know that the boy who once chased perfection finally found something better. Peace in imperfection, truth in tenderness. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not the songs that top charts, but the love that teaches others to listen. There's a strange silence that follows every storm, not emptiness, but renewal. When the noise finally faded, I began to hear the smaller sounds again. The tick of the clock on the wall, the kettle sighing, the rhythm of Jimin's breathing beside me. Those sounds became my new stage. Fame had always been loud. It demanded applause to prove that I existed. But peace doesn't need witnesses. It just asks that you stay. One night, long after midnight, I woke and found Jimin sitting on the balcony. The city glowed beneath him, silver and restless. He looked back when I slid open the door. Couldn't sleep, he said. Too many thoughts? Too many blessings, he answered with a small smile. We sat together, wrapped in a shared silence. I told him how strange it felt to live without fear for the first time. He nodded. Maybe peace feels wrong at first because we spent so long surviving noise. His words sank deep. For years, my identity had been built from motion, tour after tour, song after song. Stopping felt like failure. But Jimin was teaching me that stillness could be an act of strength. In the months that followed, I started journaling again. I wrote about what it means to stay human in a life designed to turn you into an idea. I wrote about how love, when chosen every day, becomes discipline, a practice of showing up even when the world forgets your name. Sometimes Jimin read my pages aloud, his voice soft, turning my private thoughts into poetry. You're learning to love gently, he said one morning. That's harder than loving loudly. We began visiting places that reminded us of who we were before. All the lights, the narrow street near the old dorm, the park bench where we once ate tteokbokki after practice, the empty hall where we'd waited for debut results. Each visit felt like forgiving our younger selves for their exhaustion. The other members joined us on one of those quiet trips. Namjoon brought a camera, Yoongi brought his silence, Jin brought too much food as always. Hoseok laughed until his voice cracked, and Taehyung played an old melody on his phone that none of us had heard in years. We sat in a circle beneath the fading Sunday. No one spoke about the past directly, but it hovered there, shared, heavy, holy. Finally, Namjoon said, "We thought we were building music, but maybe we were building people." Jimin reached for my hand under the table. His thumb brushed my skin once, a simple, invisible gesture, and I realized how far we'd all come from the fear of being seen. That night, driving back to Seoul, the van was filled with laughter and the smell of takeout soup. I caught our reflections in the window. 7 faces, older but softer, no longer chasing immortality. We'd stopped running. Back home, Jimin and I stayed awake, talking about time. "Do you ever think about what we'll be like in 10 years?" he asked. "Hopefully alive," I joked. He smiled. "No, really. Do you think love changes when we age?" "Everything changes," I said. "But the right things deepen." He leaned his head on my shoulder. "Then promise me something. When everything fades, when music ends and fame forgets, promise we'll still choose each other." "I already did," I whispered. Days turned into quiet rituals, small things that stitched life together. Morning walks, late night ramen, reading to each other in half-light. The ordinary became sacred because we paid attention. Sometimes I thought about all the people who'd told me love would destroy my career. Maybe they were right. In one way, it destroyed the version of me that only lived for validation. But it built something stronger in its place, a self that could finally breathe. One evening, we performed at a small charity concert, just the two of us. No lights, no fanfare, just piano and voice. We sang an old ballad about finding home in another person. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for a heartbeat before applause broke like soft rain. In that pause, I felt everything years of hiding, fighting, surviving, transform into gratitude. After the show, an older woman approached us. "You boys remind me that sincerity never goes out of style," she said. Her eyes shone as she added, "Thank you for being brave enough to be ordinary." That sentence followed me home. Brave enough to be ordinary. Maybe that's all any of us are trying to learn. Later that night, Jimin fell asleep with his head on my chest, the faint rhythm of his heartbeat syncing with mine. I watched the moonlight trace the lines of his face and realized that love doesn't erase struggle. It redeems it. It turns pain into purpose, silence into song. The next morning, I opened the window and let the cold air in. The world smelled of rain and beginnings. I brewed 2 cups of coffee, still too sweet, and whispered to the quiet room, "We're still here." And that was enough. Fame, I've learned, is a mirror that multiplies your reflection until you forget which one is real. For years, I stared at that mirror until the image looking back at me was nothing but light and noise. Now, when I see my reflection in the small kitchen window while washing dishes, I almost don't recognize that other face, the one that used to hide behind smiles built for survival. Jimin once told me, "You don't need to earn love by performing." It sounded simple then, but I didn't understand it until much later. Love that must be earned isn't love. It's negotiation. Real love is present steady, unafraid, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but always real. We started volunteering again, the way we used to before everything became complicated. A small community center in Seoul, teaching kids music on weekends. Some recognized us, most didn't care. They just wanted to play, to laugh, to feel rhythm. And somehow, that simplicity healed something deep in both of us. One afternoon, a little boy tugged at Jimin's sleeve and asked, "Are you brothers?" Jimin looked at me, smiled, and said, something like that. The boy nodded, satisfied, and went back to drumming on a plastic bucket. It was such an innocent moment, yet it left me shaken. Because in that child's world, love didn't need labels. It just existed. Later, walking home, I asked Jimin, "Do you ever think about how hard we made this for ourselves?" He looked at me thoughtful. Maybe it had to be hard so we could learn how to hold it gently. That night, I wrote those words down in my journal. So we could learn how to hold it gently. Our days became softer, built on routine and intention. We'd wake early, make breakfast, water the plants, share headlines, laugh at memes, discuss songs, argue about who used the last bit of toothpaste, the kind of small domestic chaos that used to feel impossible. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Sometimes, during rehearsals with the group, I'd look around the room and realize how much had changed without any of us noticing. The air between us was quieter, heavier with understanding. The years had sculpted us, not polished us, but carved us deeper. Namjoon was writing more essays than lyrics these days, and I think he found peace in words. Yoongi still worked late into the night, but his music felt gentler, now less fight, more faith. Hoseok smiled easily again. Jin cooked too much for everyone, as usual. And Taehyung carried that same calm sadness that makes people believe in art. Sometimes, when Jimin came to visit the studio, I'd catch the others watching him, not with judgment, but with quiet respect. What used to be taboo had turned into something they no longer needed to explain. We had all learned, in our own ways, that love doesn't threaten creation, it fuels it. One evening, after a long rehearsal, the 7 of us sat on the floor, sweaty and exhausted. The room smelled of dust and memory. Namjoon passed me a bottle of water and said, "It's strange. We used to fight so hard to protect the image of who we were supposed to be. Now I think the only thing worth protecting is who we actually are." I nodded. The mask was heavy. "And you took it off first," Yoongi said quietly. "That takes courage most people don't understand." For a moment, no one spoke. We just sat there, letting the weight of those words sink in. Later that night, at home, Jimin played a song he'd been working on. A slow, fragile melody, no big chorus, no climax, just emotion stretching out like twilight. He asked what I thought. "It feels like honesty," I said. He smiled. "That's what I was hoping for." He turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the city filtering through the curtains. We sat on the floor, backs against the wall, listening to our heartbeat echo in the quiet. "You know," I said, "for the first time, I don't feel like I have to prove anything." "That's because you already did," he replied. "You proved that truth survives." I looked at him, the soft lines of his face fading into shadow, and realized that love had turned from something I feared into something I trusted. It no longer needed to be explained. It just was. Days turned into weeks. The album we were working on neared completion. We titled it Becoming. Not because we had arrived, but because we never would. We were still evolving, still learning, still growing into ourselves. When it finally released, the reaction was different from anything before. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet but deep. People listened and wrote letters that said, "This feels like healing," or "This made me believe I can start again." That was when I understood what art was supposed to do. Not impress, not dominate, but connect. One day, during a live show, as the final song faded, I saw a sign in the crowd. It read, "Thank you for teaching us that love is not a scandal." I couldn't sing for a moment. My throat closed up. I just stood there, hand over my heart, watching thousands of lights shimmer like forgiveness. After the concert, Jimin held me backstage. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I whispered. "It feels like the world finally exhaled." He smiled. "Then breathe with it." We walked out together into the night air, hand in hand. The street was empty, except for the hum of streetlights and the faraway echo of fans still singing somewhere down the road. I looked at him and said, "You know, sometimes I forget we were ever afraid." He laughed softly. "That's how you know you healed." Healing, I realized, isn't about erasing pain. It's about remembering it without bleeding anymore. The wind blew, gentle and cold, carrying the faint scent of rain. I closed my eyes and listened. The storm had passed. The silence was alive. Time has a way of softening everything, even memories that once burned like open wounds. These days, I measure life not in schedules or achievements, but in quiet mornings. The kind where sunlight slips through the blinds and lands on the floor like forgiveness. Jimin and I have stopped counting anniversaries. Instead, we count moments. The first time we made dinner without burning anything. The day we planted a small tree on our balcony and promised to watch it grow. The night the electricity went out and we sang old songs by candlelight until dawn. The world keeps spinning, full of noise and speed, but in our home, time walks instead of runs. Sometimes, I think that's the greatest rebellion, refusing to rush what deserves to last. We've both changed. Jimin moves slower now, more deliberate, like someone who's learned the cost of energy. I've learned to rest without guilt, to work without fear. The young man who once saw love as a risk now understands it as an anchor. And yet, even in this peace, the past visits sometimes. Not as regret, but as a reminder. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a university to talk about music, discipline, and purpose. I walked into the auditorium expecting to discuss production techniques and performance pressure. But one student raised her hand and asked, "What's the hardest song you've ever written?" Without thinking, I said, "The one I didn't release." She frowned. "Why?" "Because that song was written before I knew who I was. Every lyric was perfect, but none of it was true." There was silence, the kind that holds attention more than applause. Then another student asked quietly, "And what's the easiest?" I smiled. "The one I wrote for love." When the lecture ended, a few stayed behind to thank me. One of them, a boy no older than 20, said, "I'm scared to be myself, but hearing you makes it seem possible." I shook his hand and said, "It is. It's just expensive, but worth every cost." Driving home that evening, I realized that maybe the real purpose of fame isn't to be admired. It's to make someone else braver. Jimin was waiting at home, curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching an old movie. When I told him about the student, he smiled softly. "You gave him hope," he said. "Maybe he gave me something too," I replied. A reminder that all this meant something. He reached out, took my hand, and whispered, "It always did." Sometimes, I wonder what love looks like to the outside world now. Maybe it looks ordinary to people who learned how to stay. But inside, it feels like prayer. Not the kind you recite, but the kind you live. There's something almost sacred about loving in your 30s after surviving your 20s. You've seen the world, you've lost illusions, and yet you still choose tenderness. That's courage disguised as calm. One Sunday morning, we visited my parents again. My father was tending the garden, and my mother was baking, her laughter filling the house. Jimin helped her knead dough, his hands clumsy but careful. My mother smiled at me across the table and said, "He fits here." After lunch, my father walked me to the gate. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You know, I used to think you were reckless. Now I think you're just brave." It was the closest thing to a blessing I'd ever received. On the way home, Jimin said, "He's changed." "So have we?" I replied. He looked out the window and murmured, "Maybe that's what love does. It changes everything it touches." That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I opened my journal again. I wrote about grace, how it doesn't arrive in grand gestures, but in small mercies. A forgiving word, a soft glance, a quiet acceptance. I wrote about how love doesn't erase pain. It rewrites it into something useful. And I wrote about Jimin not as perfection, but as proof that imperfection can still be beautiful when it's honest. Later, when he came to bed, he saw the open notebook and asked what I was writing. "Memories," I said. He smiled. "Then don't forget this one." He lay down beside me, his head against my chest, listening to the slow rhythm of my heartbeat. In that sound, I heard something ancient, the pulse of every decision that had led us here. The rain outside softened into mist, and somewhere in the city, a siren wailed, fading into distance. Life continued, imperfect, unpredictable, alive. And I thought, maybe that's the point. Not to find perfection, but to find someone who makes imperfection bearable, even beautiful. I turned off the light, closed my eyes, and whispered to the dark, "We made it." Jimin's hand found mine under the blanket, warm, steady, real. "Yes," he whispered, "we did." There comes a point when you stop chasing meaning and begin to live it. For years, I thought purpose was something to be discovered, a treasure buried under milestones and applause. Now I see it's something we build slowly, moment by moment, like a song that only reveals its melody once you stop trying to perfect it. The older I get, the more I understand that life isn't a ladder. It's a circle. Every joy I've experienced brings me back to the same questions I had when I was young. Who am I when no one's watching? What do I value when the music stops? Who do I stand beside when the lights go out? The answers used to scare me. Now they comfort me, because I know who I am and I know who stays. Jimin and I have begun traveling again, but differently this time. No schedules, no cameras, just us, disappearing into places where our names mean nothing. Once we took a train across northern Europe, watching the fields blur into gold and gray. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The silence between us had learned to speak its own language. One night on that trip, we stayed in a small inn near a lake. There was no Wi-Fi, no signal, no sound except the water breathing against the shore. We built a small fire outside and sat close, wrapped in a single blanket. Jimin looked at the stars and said, "It's strange how quiet the world feels when you stop performing." I looked at him. Maybe this is what truth sounds like. He smiled, eyes reflecting firelight. Then let's never stop listening to it. The wind carried his words across the lake, and I felt them settle somewhere deep inside me. Later that night, we walked barefoot along the shore. The air was cold, and the sand was wet beneath our feet. He stopped suddenly, turned to me, and asked, "Do you think we've done enough?" "What do you mean?" "Enough to be remembered kindly, enough to leave something good behind." I thought for a long moment before answering. Maybe it's not about being remembered. Maybe it's about being worth remembering. He nodded. "Then I hope our story reminds someone to be brave." "It already has," I said. We stood there for a while, watching the reflection of the moon ripple in the water, perfect only because it kept moving. When we returned to Seoul, life continued its slow rhythm. The world had moved on to new stories, new scandals, new heroes. And for the first time, I didn't mind being forgotten. Because peace isn't found in relevance. It's found in quiet persistence. I started producing again. This time for younger artists. Kids with fire in their eyes and too many dreams to hold. I saw pieces of myself in them, the hunger, the fear, the need to prove something. I tried to teach them what I'd learned too late. That the greatest art doesn't come from perfection, but from honesty. One day, after a long session, a trainee asked me, "How do you know when you've written your best song?" I smiled. "When it scares you to sing it." He frowned. "Why?" "Because that means it's true." He nodded, slowly understanding. That night, I told Jimin about it. He laughed softly. "You're turning into Namjoon." "Maybe," I said, "but with better hair." He threw a pillow at me, laughing, and in that laughter, I heard every version of us that had ever existed, young, reckless, terrified, determined. Sometimes, when the days are too quiet, we go back to the old practice room. It's smaller now, older, the mirrors cracked slightly at the edges. We sit on the floor, remembering the boys. We were the ones who thought fame would solve everything. I walk to the mirror and touch the glass. My reflection looks back older, calmer, scarred but peaceful. Behind me, I see Jimin's reflection too, watching, smiling. "Do you ever miss it?" he asks. "The chaos?" I reply. He nods. "Sometimes," I admit, "but only because it led us here." He takes my hand. "Then it was worth it." There's something profound about realizing you don't need the world to validate what you already know in your heart. That realization is freedom. We leave the studio and step into the fading daylight. The sky is painted with that soft blue that only appears before dusk. The city hums, alive but distant. "Do you ever think about the end?" Jimin asks suddenly. I look at him, half smiling. "Of what?" "Everything. The music, the fame, us." I take a deep breath. "I think endings are just beginnings that forgot to announce themselves." He laughs quietly. "That's such a Jungkook thing to say." We walk home hand in hand, and for a moment, everything feels infinite. The kind of infinite that doesn't need eternity to exist, it just needs presence. Later, as night settles, I sit by the window, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. I think about the boy I used to be, the one who measured worth in trophies, who mistook applause for love. If I could speak to him now, I'd tell him that none of that matters as much as the quiet heartbeat beside you when the world finally stops clapping. I'd tell him that love will demand everything, your pride, your certainty, your armor, and give you peace in return. And I'd tell him that when you find someone who makes you feel like yourself without pretending, hold on, that's home. The rain stops. Jimin walks in, sleepy, wearing one of my old shirts. He sits beside me, head on my shoulder. "You're thinking again," he murmurs. "Always," I say. He looks out at the wet streets below. The city looks alive tonight. It always does when we're quiet enough to see it. He smiles. And in that moment, I realize something I've been trying to name for years. Peace isn't a destination. It's a person. Mortality has a way of humbling even the loudest hearts. I never used to think about it. Life, back then, felt endless. A blur of lights, crowds, laughter, rehearsals, and noise that convinced me tomorrow would always come. But peace brings silence, and silence makes space for the questions we spend years avoiding. It was a cold evening when the thought first arrived, not with fear, but with acceptance. Jimin and I had been walking through a park near the river, watching the last of the autumn leaves drift toward the ground. He bent down to pick one up, holding it between his fingers. "It's beautiful," he said. "Even when it's dying?" I asked. "Especially then," he whispered. I didn't answer, but the image stayed with me, the way he looked at that fallen leaf, not as something lost, but as something fulfilled. That's how I want to see life someday. Not as something fading, but as something that finally made sense. As the years passed, our world continued to change. Friends married, children were born, projects ended, and new ones began. Time moved like a quiet river, steady, unstoppable, carving away what didn't matter. Sometimes I caught myself staring at old photos or younger faces, fearless and unscarred. I'd smile, remembering the hunger in those eyes, the innocence in our dreams. We wanted to change the world, but maybe the real miracle was how the world changed us instead. One evening, I found Jimin reading by the window. He looked up and asked, "Do you ever wonder what people will say about us when we're gone?" I laughed softly. "Probably that we were dramatic." He smiled. "Maybe, but I hope they say we were kind." Kind. Such a small word, yet it felt heavier than all the awards I'd ever received. The next day, we visited Namjoon's studio. He was working on a new project, something deeply philosophical, as always. When I told him about Jimin's question, he leaned back and said, "Maybe kindness is legacy. The rest fades." He was right. Fame is loud, but temporary. Kindness echoes. Over the next months, I found myself writing letters, one to each member, one to my parents, one to Jimin. Not for the end, but for remembrance. Words have always been my way of saying what my voice can't. To Jin, I wrote about laughter. How his ability to find joy in everything had saved us countless times. To Yoongi, I wrote about honesty, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be real. To Hoseok, I wrote about light, about how he taught us to dance even when our feet were heavy. To Namjoon, I wrote about thought, The way his words had always built bridges between chaos and clarity. To Taehyung, I wrote about loyalty, the quiet kind that never asked for attention. And to my parents, I wrote about forgiveness, how love, even when misunderstood, always finds its way home. The letter to Jimin was the hardest. I wrote it a dozen times before it felt right. You taught me that love isn't a rescue, it's a practice. You showed me that peace isn't found in quiet rooms, but in hearts that refuse to close. If one day you find yourself alone, remember our love didn't end, it transformed. Because everything true continues, just in different form. I sealed the letters in a box, not out of fear, but gratitude. A reminder that nothing lasts, and that's what makes it precious. Winter came early that year. Seoul was covered in a soft layer of snow that muffled the city's usual chaos. We spent nights wrapped in blankets, drinking tea, watching the world fade to white. One morning, Jimin woke me early. "Come outside," he said. I followed him to the balcony. The sunrise painted the snow in gold. He turned to me and said, "Do you realize how lucky we are to have lived long enough to feel this calm?" I nodded. "It doesn't feel like survival anymore. It feels like grace." He smiled. "Exactly." We stood there, watching the light crawl across the horizon. For once, I didn't feel the urge to capture it, to freeze it in a photo or a song. I just wanted to be there, inside it. Later that day, we visited the ocean. The air was sharp with salt and wind. Waves crashed with that endless rhythm that reminds you how small you are and how miraculous it is to be anything at all.